I am a clinical psychologist by education. I think that's probably worth mentioning. Also worth mentioning that I'm the son of a financial advisor. And there was a time in my young adulthood when those two things came together because I started my journey toward a PhD at the ripe old age of 23, which I think is a great time to be dispensing life advice for a living. I think you've got it, got it pretty well figured out when you're 23. But by the time I was finishing that PhD at 27, I was already burning out of doing clinical work, of doing sort of the medical clinical side of being a student of human behavior. And so I approached my dad, who was and is a financial advisor, and I said, Dad, look, I love studying humanity. I love thinking deeply about why people do the things that they do, but I just don't, this is kind of heavy. Like I don't know that I need to do it in this particular context. Do you have any career direction for me? And my dad, this is, whatever, 17, 18 years ago, my dad did not know the words behavioral finance or behavioral economics, but he did know enough to say, hey, I know there's a lot of counseling and a lot of psychology in the work that I do every day. And so maybe there's some application to the world of money or the world of financial planning and financial advice. And so that, that simple insight on the part of my dad, long story short, put me down a path to be where I am today, which is sort of serving as a translator between the ivory tower of academia and the folks who do the work every day.
Yeah, so true when it comes to psychology and philosophy as a financial advisor. We deal with that every day. Sometimes we're counselors when we're talking to people. Danny, when you look at some of your past life experiences, can you name just maybe a few things that shaped your belief about money decisions and maybe how they are more emotional than, I guess, logical?
Yeah, I know one question that a lot of behaviorally minded advisors like to ask is, what was your first experience of money? And so the first memory I have of money is being in kindergarten. So, 5 or 6 years old, and bringing home the form from school that is, requires you to plug in your earning, your parents to plug in how much they make and how many dependents they have and that sort of thing to determine whether or not you get free lunch or reduced lunch, like welfare, basically. And my parents fill it out and they're like, oh, you could get free lunch. And I thought, are we poor? That was my very, it was my very first experience of money, but or my very first memory of money. And when I was, when my parents were newly married, I was born 9 months and 3 days after their wedding day. And so when my parents were newlyweds, my mom worked at McDonald's. My dad had recently dropped out of an MBA program and was cutting lawns. And so, like, I grew up, in a household that transitioned from, blue collar at the very outset to then my dad being a young advisor and, slowly beginning the process of building his business. I have a brother that's 12 years younger than me, and his attitudes toward money are so different than mine because he effectively grew up in a different household with the same parents, because my parents had achieved a level of financial success at that point that would have been, impossible for young Daniel to imagine when his parents were working, flipping burgers and cutting lawns. And so, watching the attitudinal differences between myself and my brother, I think was one of those things that put me on a path. I think having discussions around stock picking and investing and compounding at the dinner table, which I was blessed to have because of, who my dad is, that was formative. And then also, I was a missionary. I dropped out of college after my freshman year. I was a missionary for my church for 2 years. I lived in the Philippines and saw an entirely different set of beliefs and perspectives and attitudes toward wealth. And I lived in a developing country and I saw how wealth corrupted and how wealth could have helped a lot. And so those, when I think about sort of formative memories, formative experiences, those couple of things would really be the ones that put me on the path to think about these things the way I do now.